21 years ago, my mother walked away from me without looking back. But the wound didn't come from her. Leaving it came from the day she returned, looked me in the eyes, and mocked me as if I'd never mattered at all. My name is Olivia. The letter had arrived folded in half, the paper slightly wrinkled as though it had passed through too many hands before reaching mine. It invited me to a community meeting regarding a trust connected to my grandfather's estate. Nothing about it made sense, least of all why I had been listed as someone who needed to attend. I hadn't been part of that side of the family for nearly 3 decades, and no one had ever made the slightest effort to reach across that distance. Still, some instinct pushed me to go, if only to understand how my name had suddenly resurfaced in their world. The meeting took place inside a wooden room at the Portland Community Center, a space that smelled faintly of old floor polish and wet jackets. Outside, a thin drizzle tapped against the fogged windows, the kind of rain that settled into your bones. As soon as I stepped inside, the air seemed to tighten, conversations dipped, heads turned just slightly, but enough for me to feel the weight of strangers' eyes, assessing whether I belonged there. And then I saw her. She sat near the front, posture straight, hands resting on a stack of documents. 21 years had changed many things between us, but not the sharp, guarded look she always carried. She didn't nod or offer any sign of recognition. Her gaze skimmed past me before dropping back to her papers, as if my presence were nothing more than an unfortunate administrative mistake. Relatives leaned toward each other, whispering. One asked aloud if someone had invited the wrong person. I took a seat on a creaking wooden chair, steadying my breath as unease crept up my spine. Whatever had pulled me into that room, it was clear I wasn't meant to disappear quietly into a corner. And deep down, I knew this meeting was merely the opening act of something far more tangled than a simple dispute over a trust. The meeting had barely begun when my mother's voice cut through the room, sharp enough to slice through whatever fragile calm I had managed to hold. She announced that she had no idea why I was present, insisting someone must have added me to the list by mistake. Her tone was loud enough to reach the back row, and a few relatives let out small, amused laughs, the kind meant to sting without leaving a mark anyone could call out. I kept my eyes on the stack of papers in front of me, choosing silence over reaction. When I opened the folder and flipped to the 3rd page, I froze. There, in a shaky but unmistakable hand, was my grandfather's signature beside a single line identifying a related beneficiary. My name, Olivia Grant. A chill crawled up my spine. There was no reason for my name to be there. Not after decades of distance. Before I could study it further. My mother reached across the table and snatched the papers away, her fingers tightening on the edges as if she could erase what I had just seen. She steadied her breath, trying to maintain a mask of control, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. Daniel Wexler, her attorney, chose that moment to lean forward. In a measured, almost clinical voice, he asked her whether she was certain she wanted to deny any connection between me and my grandfather. The question dropped into the room like a stone, pulling every gaze toward him. My mother stiffened, eyes narrowing at him in a way I had never seen before, as if she feared not what he had asked, but what he might reveal next. In that single instant, the ridicule she had thrown my way no longer felt like simple contempt. It felt calculated, protective, as though she was fighting to keep something hidden, and my presence threatened to drag it into the open. The meeting moved on, but the air had tightened around us, thick with tension no one dared name. My mother spoke with growing urgency, repeating that I had no place there, that I contributed nothing, that the trust and everything tied to it had nothing to do with me. Her voice faltered only when Daniel began asking questions she clearly did not want raised. He asked if she was confident the documents provided were complete. He asked who had signed the withdrawal forms from 2003. He asked why my name appeared once in the paperwork, lightly crossed out, and then rewritten beneath it. Each question pushed her closer to the edge, her cheeks flushing a deep red as she snapped at him to explain why he was digging into matters she claimed were irrelevant, the relatives, who only minutes before had been amused by her disdain, now shifted uneasily. The room filled with low murmurs, a soft rustling of doubt. Daniel continued taking notes, his focus never once drifting toward me, yet every question he asked felt deliberately pointed, like he was laying a trail of breadcrumbs for everyone, but especially for me. When the meeting paused for a short break, I stepped back from the table, trying to process the unease curling in my chest. An older relative approached, leaning in so quietly I almost missed his words. He said my grandfather never acted without a reason, especially when it came to me. Whatever he had done, the man insisted, he had done with intention. The comment hit like a quiet bolt of lightning. I stood still, feeling the ground shift beneath a truth I had never expected to encounter. All my life, I had assumed I was forgotten, unimportant, a leftover piece of someone else's story. But now, watching the fear flicker across my mother's face as she avoided my gaze, I understood something else entirely. This wasn't the end of an old rift. It was the beginning of uncovering why it had been carved so deep. The night after the meeting, I returned to my small office in Portland with a knot in my chest that wouldn't loosen. I opened my laptop, letting the cold blue glow wash across the room as I logged into the software I'd spent years mastering. I'd used it to uncover fraud for strangers, to track money trails hidden behind shell companies and manipulated ledgers. But this time, the investigation wasn't for a client. It was for me. I downloaded every archive linked to my grandfather's accounts, opening each PDF, each faded scan of old statements. Outside, a train screeched across Steel Bridge, the metal groan echoing like a warning. I felt it in my bones as I scrolled through page after page until sudden stillness took over me. The first thing that caught my eye were the withdrawals. Large sums taken in 2003, 2005, 2008. The dates lined up too cleanly with the milestones I wished I could forget the year I was left on my own. The year I scraped together tuition payments alone. The year everything I'd built nearly collapsed. The signatures scribbled on each form were meant to resemble my grandfather's, but the slant was wrong. The pressure was wrong. The hand behind them wasn't his. A prickle spread across my scalp. I kept digging, my pulse growing louder than the hum of my computer. A notation popped up on a transfer from the year I turned 20, support for OG. See, the amount was $40,000. That year I'd worked double shifts and gone hungry more times than I cared to admit. No one supported me. No one even checked on me. So if that money had been meant for me, where had it gone? My stomach tightened as I dialed the bank, trying to keep my voice steady while the employee sifted through old logs. When the answer came, I felt everything inside me go still. The person who signed for the $40,000 was my mother. I stared at my screen, the glow turning my reflection into something pale and unfamiliar. She hadn't just walked away from me all those years ago. She'd taken what little help I had left. She'd taken what my grandfather tried to give me. As the shock turned sharp, another realization slid into place. I thought of Daniel's questions during the meeting, the calm precision with which he'd dismantled her narrative piece by piece, the way he seemed to watch her. Not me. He'd known long before any of this reached me. A tremor ran through me, not from fear, not from anger, but from the sense that I had stepped into a story far bigger, far older, and far more tangled than I had ever imagined. And whatever awaited next, I understood one thing clearly. There was no turning back. The next meeting felt like stepping into the eye of a storm. The room hummed with unspoken tension as relatives settled into their seats, avoiding one another's eyes. My mother looked up when I walked in, her glare slicing through the charged silence. Though she did her best to compose herself for the audience, she still believed she controlled. I slid the folder across the table toward her, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me as I asked who had signed for the $40,000 withdrawn in 2005. The color drained from her face. Chairs creaked as people shifted, the room tightening into stillness. She opened her mouth, ready to dismiss it all, but Daniel spoke first. His tone held no hesitation as he explained that the signature comparison verified the signer was indeed her. Heads turned sharply in his direction. My mother's eyes blew wide, disbelief flickering through them. She had never expected betrayal from the one person she thought was on her payroll. Her denial crumbled into anger, and she redirected it at me with venom. She called my worth into question, reducing my entire existence to a string of accusations meant to humiliate me in front of anyone willing to listen. I felt the blow, deep and familiar, but I refused to respond. The restraint surprised her and everyone else far more than her outburst ever could. Her words didn't land the way she wanted. Instead of amusement, faces around us shifted into discomfort. Doubt finally found its way into the room. For the first time in years, people weren't sure if she was the victim she always pretended to be. I stood up and walked out, letting the hallway's cold fluorescent light swallow me whole. My footsteps echoed until another pair joined behind me. Daniel. He caught up, lowering his voice so only I could hear. He told me not to let her words shape how I saw myself. That truth had its own timing. That it would come when it was meant to. There was something weighted beneath his calm that unsettled me. When I looked into his eyes, I saw it clearly he was carrying something he hadn't yet said. I asked him what he knew. He hesitated, then admitted he had met with my grandfather many times in the final years of his life. My grandfather had told him that one day I would need answers, real ones, and Daniel would be the person to ensure I got them. The air thinned around me. Why me? Why Daniel? What had my grandfather feared, Daniel didn't explain. He only said I would understand when the moment came. When we stepped back into the room, that moment arrived faster than either of us expected. My mother had lost the last grip on her composure. She was shouting at the meeting's coordinator that she didn't want me to have anything, that I didn't deserve. Then she realized what she'd said, and who had heard it. Silence crashed down. Faces turned. The atmosphere shifted with a force that felt almost physical. And standing in that heavy, breathless quiet, I understood with absolute clarity this wasn't just a fight between mother and daughter. This was the unraveling of every lie she had sown over the last 21 years. I didn't sleep after the explosion in that meeting room. My mother's unfinished outburst scraped through my mind in loops, sharp and relentless. By morning, the only thing I knew for certain was that I needed answers. So I walked to the Portland Central Library and asked for my grandfather's archived records. An older librarian disappeared into storage and returned with a dusty box she said had never been opened since it was submitted. Inside, the smell of old paper drifted up. A worn brown ledger lay at the top, its leather cracked and its pages curled with age. When I opened it, my grandfather's trembling handwriting spilled across the pages. One entry stopped me cold. He wrote that he no longer trusted my mother, that I would one day need protection from her selfishness. My hands shook as I read it. He had known, long before I was old enough to understand. Further down, his message hit harder. He wrote that when the time came, Daniel would know what to do. Seeing Daniel's name inked there made the ground shift beneath me. His role went far deeper than anything I had assumed. At the bottom of the box lay a sealed envelope labeled to be opened only in case of dispute. Inside were instructions to the bank freeze any withdrawals without his signature, and hand guardianship of financial matters to Daniel if conflict ever arose. It wasn't a note. It was a shield he'd built around me in anticipation of exactly this moment. When I stepped outside, Daniel called. He had already filed a motion to unseal the remaining documents. My mother had tried to stop him, but he wasn't backing down. The truth was no longer avoidable, and she knew it. Later that day, I met Daniel at a cafe along the Willamette. The wind off the river was sharp enough to sting, and the look on his face carried the same cold weight. He admitted, carefully, that my grandfather had asked him to watch over me, to make sure I could stand on my own if my mother ever failed me. The words hollowed me out. He wasn't my guardian legally, but he had acted on my grandfather's wishes. The harder truth followed. He had arranged financial support years ago, tuition help, small funds meant to ease the burden I carried alone. But my mother had intercepted nearly all of it. While I worked multiple jobs and skipped meals, she siphoned away the only safety net ever meant for me. By the next meeting, the tension had risen like pressure in a sealed room. I confronted her, asking if she had taken the money. Her temper snapped. She yelled that she took it because she deserved it, her voice rising until she realized every person in the room was staring at her in stunned disbelief. Before she could recover, Daniel stood and announced that the unsealing would proceed the next day. My mother demanded loyalty, insisting he represented her. His reply cut through the silence like a blade. I represent the truth first. In that moment, the balance shifted. This was no longer a family fight. It was the truth finally breaking through. The unsealing felt like a trial disguised as a community meeting. Every seat was taken, the air so heavy I could feel it pressing against my ribs. My mother sat rigid in the front row, fingers locked around her papers, shooting me looks meant to cut. When the coordinator placed the sealed file on the table, she leapt up, insisting there was no legal basis to open anything. Her voice cracked under its own weight. Daniel interrupted her with a calm, resonant firmness that froze the room. He said there was every reason to open the documents, and that reason was the truth. She stared at him in disbelief, reminding him he was her attorney. But he didn't waver. He said my grandfather had trusted him to protect his wishes before anyone else's. The shock on her face was immediate. He announced he could no longer represent her if she continued trying to suppress the contents. Gas broke across the room as she stumbled back, her papers slipping from her hands. When he broke the seal, the old pages rustled like a final exhale. He read aloud a handwritten letter listing every unauthorized withdrawal, each one signed by her. Not my grandfather. Whispers swelled, horror spreading as the truth surfaced. Then came the final lines, my grandfather's plea that my life no longer be shaped by her selfishness. The room went silent. In that stillness, her entire facade crumbled. When the unsealed documents were placed on the table, my mother collapsed back into her chair, drained of the defiance she had clung to for years. But the unraveling was only beginning. The coordinator turned to the extended section of my grandfather's will, his voice steady despite the tension sharpening the air. The first revelation hit the room like a blow. He stated plainly that my mother had abandoned me, not because she was unable to care for me, but because she feared the burden I would place on the marriage she wanted more. A stunned hush fell. Someone whispered an exclamation under their breath, and my mother buried her face in her hands, unable to deny what had been written in her own father's hand. The next document was a detailed ledger tracing not only the unauthorized withdrawals, but the funds designated specifically for me, money meant to support me during the years I struggled alone. Each transfer bore her signature. While I was skipping meals in a cramped apartment at 20, she had been signing for support that never reached me. My heart lurched, the ache sharp and immediate. Then another passage was read aloud. My grandfather had entrusted Daniel with the responsibility of protecting me if conflict ever emerged. He wrote that he trusted Daniel more than his own daughter. The room shifted, every gaze turning toward Daniel. My mother gasped, on the brink of tears. Confronted by a truth she could no longer twist, Daniel's expression held quiet sorrow, but also certainty. The last veil had fallen. Finally, the closing provisions were read. The trust was legally designated to me alone. Any unauthorized withdrawals were to be recalculated, and no relative, not even through my mother, had the right to challenge the inheritance on her behalf. Her influence ended in that moment. The meeting adjourned to a silence so dense it felt physical. No one looked at her. No one dismissed me as an outsider anymore. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of those years lift just enough for me to breathe. I was no longer the abandoned child in the corner. I had finally stepped into the place my grandfather meant for me to stand. When the room finally emptied, I stayed behind, staring at the rows of wooden chairs still holding the ghost of the moment. The air carried a faint warmth that reminded me of my grandfather, the only person who had protected me even when I never knew it. It felt like he was still there, lingering in the quiet. My mother approached with swollen eyes, trying to form an explanation. I shook my head before she could speak. I told her I didn't need reasons anymore. I needed peace. She stood there, smaller than I had ever seen her, and for the first time I felt no fear, no longing, only closure. I wasn't the young woman she had once abandoned. I chose not to sue her, even though I could have. I didn't want revenge. I asked the court only to honor my grandfather's wishes, confirm the trust was mine, and set boundaries that kept her from stepping back into my life. A quiet victory, but one that closed a wound 2 decades deep. Outside, a soft Portland rain met me. Daniel joined me, resting a hand on my shoulder, telling me my grandfather would be proud. I lifted my face to the gray sky and whispered that I knew. Then I walked forward, free of the shadow that had followed me for 21 years.